At a time immemorable, a large mass of copper weighing nearly 2 tons had found its way into a sandbar in the middle of the Ontonagon River. This large mass of copper was revered by the Ojibwe in the area as sacred for as long as can be remembered by them. For almost 200 years, this large piece of float copper became one of the most famous rocks in the United States, if not the world. From being worshipped by the natives all the way to its final place in the Smithsonian, this is the story of the Ontonagon Boulder. How's it going, guys? Welcome back to Jeff Up North. And I've mentioned it before in a few other videos about the Ontonagon Boulder, and I figured it was time to get into its story. In the early explorations of the Great Lake region, rumors of a copper boulder weighing up to 5 tons or as big as a house were spreading across the region. According to records, a Jesuit expedition in 1667, a missionary by the name of Claude de Blon confirmed the existence of a large chunk of copper that he assumed weighed up to 800 pounds. Now, there's no confirmation that this was the Ontonagon Boulder he had found, but it did add to the allure of people to the region because they heard of vast quantities of copper. That didn't happen for a while down the road yet. Fast forward 100 years, and a fur trader by the name of Alexander Henry was drawn to the area due to talk of mass amounts of copper in the Keweenaw region. He was guided by some Ojibwe natives to the boulder and officially confirmed the existence of this large piece of float copper. He is credited as being the first white man to lay eyes on this massive copper. He was a bit upset though because he was picturing a 5-ton chunk of copper the size of a house, but it ended up being only 3,704 pounds, measuring 50 inches long, 40 inches wide, and 18 inches thick, which at the time was the largest known chunk of pure metallic copper in the world. The Ontonagon Boulder gets its name because it was found in the Ontonagon River about 20 miles of the mouth of the Ontonagon River near the city of Ontonagon, which empties into Lake Superior. The word Ontonagon comes from a story that an Ojibwe woman had lost her bowl in the river, where she exclaimed Nindondagon or Nantaunagon, which translates to my dish or my bowl is gone. We don't really know exactly how the Ontonagon Boulder reached its final resting place, but we do know it is float copper, and float copper is copper that was ripped from the bedrock when the glaciers extended across Michigan, and eventually the glaciers melted, depositing large quantities of float copper across the entire Midwest, as far south as Indiana. It could have either been deposited there originally when the glaciers melted, and after all the flooding washed everything away, what was left was a large piece of copper sitting on the sandbar. Or after it was deposited by the glaciers, it could have slid into the river off of one of the high embankments that surround this area of the Ontonagon River. And one other theory is that the ancient miners were hauling it on their canoe or raft, whatever they had at the time, and it fell off in the middle of the river, and they had no way of getting it out, and it just stayed there until it was found again. Whichever way it got there, and the Ojibwe, upon their habitation of this region, revered it as a Gitche Manitou, or a conduit for them to speak to their great spirit. And then the white men found it. When Alexander Henry had come across this copper boulder, he broke a chunk of copper off the boulder with his hatchet and was very impressed with how malleable the metal was. Most of the boulder's surface had been flattened smooth due to thousands of years of other people breaking chunks off that were sticking out any sharp edges that could be removed easily with the primitive tools that were also found around the boulder, were broken off and then taken away by others. And what remained was this large chunk of copper. There was a lot of talk about this large chunk of copper in the local area, but during the New England period between 1763 and 1783, word had begun to spread out of the Great Lakes region. At first, it was believed to be just a myth, but soon knowledge of the copper deposits in what is now Michigan's Upper Peninsula, or namely the Keweenaw Peninsula and Michigan's Upper Peninsula, more people were interested in possibly striking it rich. There was enough interest in it that even when Benjamin Franklin was drawing the international lines between the US and Canada, he even had knowledge of the copper deposits even on Isle Royal, and with a quick stroke of his quill, extended the United States border into Lake Superior to include Isle Royal, even though it was only 15 miles off of the shore of Canada. In 1818, Illinois became a state, and by act of Congress, the Michigan Territory was to include part of Minnesota, all of Wisconsin, and the rest of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Lewis Cass was appointed governor of this new territory and set an expedition to better relations with the local Indian tribes and to draw more accurate maps of the region. On May 24th, 1820, they set out from Detroit, Michigan, and by June 27th, they had reached the Ontonagon River. They started upstream to try and find this mythical Ontonagon Boulder that had been described by Alexander Henry years prior. After a strenuous 20-mile journey on some of the harshest terrain Cass had ever encountered in his life, they came across the boulder. 6 years later, 1826, Governor Cass ordered George F. Porter with a detachment of soldiers to retrieve the Ontonagon Boulder for the United States. After another strenuous journey, Porter had failed to retrieve the boulder from its sandbar crib in the middle of the Ontonagon River. They had lacked the specialized equipment needed to remove it from its resting place and ended up just leaving it there. 1840, Douglas Houghton was assigned to be state geologist and brought the chief state surveyor, Bela Hubbard, to see the famous copper rock as it had become known as. Many tried, many failed, but no one could quite figure out how to get that Ontonagon Boulder, that famous copper rock, out of the river. Julius Eldred had first heard about the Ontonagon Boulder from a man that was on the Lewis Cass expedition. In 1841, he went straight to the Ontonagon River to find this boulder that had been described by so many people in the past as the largest chunk of copper ever seen. Believing the boulder belonged to the Indians, Eldred paid the local chief, Chief Contica, which is now the name of a restaurant in White Pine, Michigan. But he paid Contica $150 for this massive copper. After a careful study of the boulder and its surrounding areas, Eldred returned to Detroit to devise a plan. Returning the next year in 1842, he was unable to remove the boulder from its resting place and once again returned to Detroit to devise a better plan. 1843. Julius Eldred is adamant on getting this copper boulder out of the Ontonagon River and bring it home to Detroit and show off his spoils. So he traveled back up to Ontonagon to once again try to get this damn rock out of the water. Upon arrival, he had found that a man named Jim Paul accompanied a group of local copper miners, and they were guarding the rock. What happened was, in 1842, the land had not yet been surveyed yet for any industrialization, but the state did offer temporary permits for exploration and to mine the land around Ontonagon. And in that claim lie the Ontonagon Boulder. And since the claim had been issued by the Secretary of War, Julius Eldred had no choice but to pay, except this time, it was for $1,365. Now that Eldred had taken 3 separate trips, invested almost $2,000 into this boulder itself, and he had built a skid to get the boulder onto, block and pulleys, 20 men accompanying him, and they began to get this copper boulder out of the river. Using the block and tackle pulley systems, they were able to get the boulder up the 50-foot cliff and onto the cart. For 4 miles, the cart was pushed on railroad tracks, but every 16 feet, they had to remove the tracks from behind the cart, bring them to the front, and push the cart another 16 feet and repeat the process for the 4 miles until they reached a raft that was sitting in the Ontonagon River downstream, where they then loaded the boulder onto the raft. They then floated the Ontonagon Boulder down the river towards Lake Superior. Once they reached Lake Superior, they loaded onto a schooner, the Algonquin, and then the U.S. Secretary of War ordered the seizure of the Ontonagon Boulder from Eldred and his men. Eldred pleaded and begged and explained the hardships and the cost to get this boulder, even to where they were now. And finally, the agent in charge allowed him to keep possession of the boulder and continue on his way, sail across Lake Superior, transfer over to Lake Huron, and eventually all the way down to his home in Detroit. An extract from the Buffalo Gazette for the year of 1843 says, "The copper was shipped from the Ontonagon on the schooner Algonquin to the head of the falls of the St. Mary's, where it was transferred to a Mackinac boat, and after passing around the rapids, was shipped on the schooner Brewster to Detroit, where it arrived on October 11th, 1843. Once he was back in Detroit, Eldred put the Ontonagon Boulder on display as a natural wonder and charged people 25 cents per person just to look at it and admire it. At this time in Washington, D.C., there was a growing feeling that this boulder should be kept in the national capital. An Englishman named Smithsonian had donated a large amount of money for a national museum, and he had put his nephew in charge of this money. But by this time, his nephew had already passed away, and plans to build the museum were already in place. This museum would eventually become the Smithsonian. And once again, the U.S. government wanted to take something from its citizens. Except instead of the Secretary of War, it came from the U.S. District Attorney and ordered that the Ontonagon Boulder be confiscated. Once again, Eldred was pleading and protesting against all he had worked for to get this large chunk of copper to where it is now. Soldiers still confiscated it, placed it on a ship, which took it to Buffalo, New York. It was then taken by rail, and Julius Eldred followed it the entire way. He did not leave it. He wanted to keep his boulder, which you can't blame him after all the amount of money that he put into it time, planning, and efforts. After about 3 years of debating, pleading, and a lot of publicity on this case, the first session of the 28th Congress passed an act on January 26, 1847, authorizing the Secretary of War to make a settlement. Eldred was then granted a sum of $5,664.48 as compensation for the ownership of the Ontonagon Boulder. For a temporary time, it sat in front of the quartermaster's office of the Secretary of War. For 8 years, the Ontonagon Boulder, which was now nationally famous, sat in the yard of the Quartermaster's Bureau of the War Department. In 1858, it made it onto its new home in the United States National Museum, which we now know today as the Smithsonian Museum. In the 1960s, there were a lot of people that were very upset that the Ontonagon Boulder had lost its identity due to the fact of anyone that wanted to come see it would ask the staff, and the staff would have no idea what they were talking about. There was talk of returning it back to the state of Michigan, perhaps in the state capitol building in Lansing. 1971, the boulder was moved to the National Museum's Our Restless Earth display in the Physical Geology Hall. This appeared to make people happy, and the staff was updated on the Ontonagon Boulder's history and relevance to the country's history. In 1987, Michigan celebrated its 150th anniversary of becoming a state. And as a part of this celebration, after 144 years of being away from home, the Ontonagon Boulder was paraded down the streets of Ontonagon for the annual Memorial Day Parade. It was then placed on display at the A.E. Seaman Mineralogical Museum at Michigan Technological University for a month before it was returned back to the Smithsonian. As of today, the Ontonagon Boulder still resides in the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and the museum says it has frequently been on display. From what I've been able to find out, is it has not been on display for the last 30 years. I found this article while looking for a little more information on the Ontonagon Boulder. It is from the Michigan Enjoyer. It is titled, "The Feds Stole Our Sacred Copper Boulder and Won't Give It Back." They confiscated a massive hunk of ore in 1847 and is currently gathering dust in a storeroom. In recent years, the famous Elgin marbles have garnered controversy. What right does the British Museum have over statues that originally graced the Parthenon? Michigan has a similar controversy brewing for well over a century. Our most popular hunk of Upper Peninsula ore was removed from the shores of the Ontonagon River by an enterprising Detroiter, only to be confiscated by the feds and taken to Washington, D.C. in 1843. The 3,000-pound copper boulder is currently held deep in Smithsonian storage room, and it's time to repatriate it back to Ontonagon where it belongs. According to indigenous tribes who have asked for it to be returned, the Ontonagon boulder is a sacred object, and it's also significant to the region's mining history and culture. More relevant, perhaps, no one cares about it at our nation's capital. According to an 1895 report on the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution by Charles Moore, a Detroit area writer and secretary for Senator James McMillan, the Ontonagon copper boulder was moved to the museum from the patent office in 1858. While the museum says it's been on frequent display at the National Museum of Natural History, the last time it was on display was 30 years ago. Moore said before the Ontonagon boulder was moved to Washington and forgotten, it was worshipped as a manitou by the superstitious Indians during uncounted years, the siren of mining adventurers, while yet the flag of England floated over the lake country, and the objective point of hazardous expeditions by explorer and scientist. Smithsonian told Enjoyer that it intends to eventually install the boulder as a part of the permanent Hall of Geology, Gems, and Minerals, but the museum has had 167 years to create a permanent exhibit for this special piece of Michigan's history, and it hasn't done so. It's time to put the Ontonagon boulder back where it belongs, the west branch of the Ontonagon River. It wouldn't be hard to build a simple structure right off of US 45 to show it off, or give the Keweenaw Bay Indian community unbridled access. Michigan's most famous copper boulder belongs near its native riverbed, not in a government building's basement. Brendan Clary is deputy editor of the Michigan Enjoyer. And that, my friends, is the history of the Ontonagon Boulder. A lot of trouble and money had gone through the efforts of removing it and bringing it to Detroit, where it was then taken by the federal government, put on display, and then thrown in the basement. It's not by means the largest chunk of flow copper found. It is just the first large boulder that had been found, and knowledge of it had spread around the country, possibly even the world, but it's, apart from locals in the Upper Peninsula around the Ontonagon, the Keweenaw area, it's probably been forgotten for the most part across the country. Personally, I think it should be brought back to the UP. I believe where it was found is now the area of the Victoria Dam, near the old Victoria copper mine, and the ghost town, Old Victoria, which I will be visiting again this spring, hopefully. That's what I think. I know a lot of other people interested in the history of Michigan's Upper Peninsula and the copper culture and the copper mining, they also think it should be brought back. And I do think it should be brought back. So what do you think? What do you think? Do you think it should be brought back? Do you think it should be put on display at the Smithsonian in DC, or put on display somewhere in copper country near where it was found, back to its home? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends. Thank you very much for joining. We'll see you next time.